Hello, and welcome to Historical Nights. A space where the noise of the modern world softens, where the pace of the past gently unfolds, and where the quiet rhythms of history lull you into a place of deep calm. Tonight, we invite you to travel through the final chapters of a life that once stood at the very center of global events. A life that echoed across continents and generations. And yet, like all lives, drew slowly to a close. Not with thunderous speeches or the roar of warplanes overhead, but with quiet steps, retreating from the world stage. These are the twilight years of Winston Churchill. Often remembered for his resolute wartime leadership and his gravelly, unforgettable voice. Churchill's later years offer something different. Less known, but no less telling. They unfold with reflection, resignation, and, on occasion, reverence. Tonight, we will not revisit the clamor of the Battle of Britain or the heat of political combat. Instead, we will explore Churchill's life in the soft light of dusk. When the crowds have dispersed, the speeches have ended, and the days grow quiet. Let yourself settle in. Feel the weight of blankets on your skin. The hush of a dimly lit room. And imagine yourself stepping into another time. We'll begin, as always, with the gentle rhythm of daily life. A slower, quieter Churchill, living amidst books, cigars, and silence. Then, we will journey into a particular story, his final years in Parliament. Later, we'll uncover some curious details of his private world, letters, art, and his enduring fascination with history. And finally, we'll contrast the rhythms of his retreat with the noise of a society he no longer fully recognized. And now, let's begin with the comforting cadence of a life no longer in a hurry. Oh, and if you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. I am super curious where you're all listening from. So, drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Always blows my mind how people are falling asleep to this all over the world. Imagine yourself at Chartwell. The year is 1957. Autumn is folding gently into winter. The air is cool, touched with the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. Leaves, brown and curled, rustle underfoot as a breeze glides down the garden path. You are walking along a stone walkway, its edges softened by years of moss and rain. Ahead stands the red brick house, modest in scale, but dignified in bearing. Its ivy-clad walls and tall windows seem not to impose, but to invite. This is where Winston Churchill spent many of his final, waking years. A man once burdened by the weight of empire, now carried only by the slow passage of time. And here, in the folds of the Kentish countryside, the rhythm of his life took on a new, quieter tempo. Chartwell was more than a home. It was a sanctuary. Purchased in 1922, long before Churchill would become Prime Minister. It remained his favorite retreat for over 4 decades. The house itself is not grand in the way of aristocratic estates. It is domestic, warm, and full of odd charm. Corridors that turn at strange angles. Fireplaces with coal grates glowing amber in the evenings. A study with windows facing the long, sloping valley below. From those windows, Churchill could see the ponds he had constructed himself, by hand and by laborers. He once said he liked to build as well as led. Now, in his later years, the ponds reflected more than the sky. They reflected memory. Behind the house, rose gardens gently declined into terraced lawns. And at the far end, the famous brick wall, built largely by Churchill during the 1920s with his own trowel, still stood, aging gracefully. It was said that when life became too difficult in London, he would retreat here and find the silence between thoughts. Churchill never conformed to conventional schedules, not even in old age. His mornings began slowly. Rarely before 8:30, sometimes not until 9 o'clock or later. He would rise in his nightshirt and dressing gown, shuffle to the edge of his bed, and wait quietly as his breakfast was brought in on a silver tray. The tray always included a pot of weak black tea, barely sweetened. A few slices of toast, gently browned. And a soft-boiled egg, nestled in a white porcelain cup with a silver spoon nearby. His beloved marmalade, too, thick and golden, with a bitter edge. Sometimes, while he sipped his tea, his wife Clementine would sit across from him. Other times, he would be alone, eyes half closed, drifting between dreams and recollections. From the windows of his bedroom, the Kent hills rolled outward like soft fabric, green and gold and gray, depending on the light. And always, silence. Not a silence of emptiness, but of peace. By late morning, Churchill's secretary would arrive, often a young woman, clipboard in hand, quietly prepared. He would remain in bed for another hour or two, propped up by pillows, dictating letters and memos. Even in retirement, his mind was active. He responded to admirers, to former colleagues, to heads of state. The tone of his correspondence had softened over the years, not as sharp or commanding. More thoughtful. Sometimes even nostalgic. "Dear General Eisenhower," he once began, "I am glad to know you are well. We grow older, but the memory of our cause remains evergreen." Many letters ended with a simple phrase, "Yours ever, Winston." No title. No fanfare. Just a soft echo of connection. The morning correspondence would be followed by a brief review of the day's newspapers, the Times, the Daily Telegraph, and occasionally the Manchester Guardian, though he found its tone less agreeable. He would make small remarks under his breath as he read. Grumbling at editorials, chuckling at cartoons, shaking his head at headlines. But mostly, he read in silence. After a light lunch, often soup, cold meats, and a glass of diluted wine, Churchill would sometimes retire to his studio. The studio at Chartwell was a high-ceilinged space with tall windows and the faint smell of turpentine and canvas. Here, he painted with the energy of someone much younger. Though his hand had grown less steady, his eye remained sharp. He preferred oils. Thick, textured strokes. Colors rich and comforting, cerulean skies, burnt sienna rooftops, olive green trees. He once said painting helped banish the black dog. In his twilight years, that dog still visited from time to time, but less fiercely. He painted landscapes, mostly. Churches, ponds, the south of France, Marrakesh from memory. He would hum, quietly, as he worked. Tunes from old music halls. Sometimes snippets of military marches. But mostly, there was only the brush. The canvas. And time. In the late afternoon, Churchill would sometimes take short walks in the garden, always with an aide nearby, often with a cane in hand. He moved slowly, deliberately. He would stop often, to inspect a hedge, to watch birds at the feeders, to comment on the condition of the paths. His presence was felt more than heard. Sometimes, he would pause by the fish ponds he had built. The koi gliding below the surface like quiet thoughts. He would stare into the water for long minutes. The wind moving faintly through the tall reeds. And once, while resting on a bench overlooking the orchard. He murmured softly to himself. The rhythm of their lives, it never really leaves you. His staff weren't sure if he meant the trees, the birds, the soldiers, or something else entirely. Perhaps he didn't know either. Evenings at Chartwell were quiet. The house was dimly lit. Churchill preferred soft yellow bulbs and fires rather than harsh modern light. He would dress for dinner, even in solitude. A dark jacket. A black tie. A white pocket square. His sense of dignity remained untouched by retirement. Dinner was usually served in the small dining room. Roast beef, game, potatoes, seasonal vegetables. Cooked plainly, but well. He would sip a small glass of brandy. Then, whiskey. Always measured. Rarely drunk, despite his reputation. After dinner, he would read by the fire. Gibbon, Macaulay, Shakespeare. Sometimes detective novels, Agatha Christie in particular. The crackle of the hearth filled the room. A clock ticked gently from the mantelpiece. Outside, the wind curled around the corners of the house. And he would read until his eyes began to blur. Then set the book down quietly in his lap. And drift into thought. By 10 or 11, he would return to his bedroom. A servant might have turned down the bed. His slippers placed neatly at the foot. He would change into his nightshirt. Take a final sip of water. Perhaps stare a moment longer out the window. The Kent countryside, now cloaked in dark blue. A soft mist hanging above the trees. A single barn owl calling in the distance. He would sigh. Draw the curtains. And let the quiet enfold him. In that stillness, the weight of decades slipped gently into memory. The speeches. The war rooms. The arguments. The accolades. None of it vanished. But none of it demanded anything anymore. The rhythm of his life had changed. Now, it asked only for rest. Imagine yourself seated in the gallery of the House of Commons. The benches are worn with decades of use. The lighting is subdued. And the chamber, though busy with figures moving and murmuring, carries an unmistakable air of history. In the front benches, among the murmuring members, sits a figure wrapped in layers of cloth. An overcoat heavy on his shoulders. A dark hat resting on his knee. This is Winston Churchill in 1953. A man now nearly 80 years old. Still Prime Minister. Still formidable. But slower. Quieter. More distant than before. This is where our story begins, not in a moment of triumph, but in the long exhale after a life of action. Churchill returned to office in October 1951. After 6 years in the political wilderness. Many thought he had done enough. At 76, he was visibly aged. His walk was more a shuffle. His speech, slower and more contemplative. And yet, the Conservative Party called him back. And the people voted him in once more. To some, it felt like a restoration. To others, a relic of a past era rising once again. Churchill himself seemed uncertain. He did not campaign vigorously. He made few promises. He simply offered himself. A familiar voice in uncertain times. The world he returned to, however, was not the one he had left. Britain was tired. still rebuilding from the war. Rationing had only recently ended. And the winds of change, economic, political, and colonial, were already whispering through Parliament. Churchill stepped back onto the stage. But the script had changed. In June 1953, while still in office, Churchill suffered a serious stroke. He was attending a dinner at 10 Downing Street when he suddenly collapsed in his chair, unable to move the left side of his body. The room fell still. But instead of alerting the public, his inner circle chose silence. The press was told only that the Prime Minister was indisposed. Behind closed doors, his doctor worked tirelessly. And remarkably, within a few weeks, Churchill recovered enough to resume limited duties. But something had shifted. He could no longer deliver long speeches. He tired easily. And though he remained intellectually sharp, he began to forget names, lose his place in meetings, pause more frequently when reading notes. He knew, and those closest to him knew, he was fading. Not rapidly, but unmistakably. Yet he stayed. Why? Some believe it was a sense of unfinished duty. Others say he feared what would come after him. That without his guidance, Britain might drift too far from its past. Or perhaps he simply didn't know how to stop. In the early 1950s, Churchill's working day began later and ended sooner. He held fewer cabinet meetings. He delegated more decisions. Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, his intended successor, took on increasing responsibilities. Churchill would often remain silent in key discussions, then offer a single, carefully chosen sentence. Half reflective, half poetic. We must not only look ahead, but remember the fog behind us. Some ministers found him frustrating. Others revered him still. He remained, to the world, the voice of Britain. But internally, he was more shadow than substance. He once joked, after reading a dull economic report, "I am the ghost of a former prime minister." And yet, ghosts often linger longer than expected. Despite his declining physical strength, Churchill's mind still turned to global affairs. He longed to meet with Soviet leaders. He dreamed of one final summit, a talk among the old lions, he called it. He feared nuclear war. And he worried about the growing tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. In one of his final major policy speeches, he said, "We must never cease to hope for peace, and never stop preparing for it." It was not stirring. It was not rousing. But it was sincere. Churchill saw the coming storm of the Cold War. And though he could no longer stand at its center, he tried, quietly, to steady the ship. He sent discreet letters to President Eisenhower. He reached out to old allies. He urged dialogue over division. But the world was younger now. Its leaders more impatient. His voice, though respected, no longer led the choir. By early 1955, the signs could no longer be ignored. Churchill could barely hold cabinet sessions. He sometimes drifted off mid-meeting. He repeated stories. He forgot key names, even those of senior ministers. Anthony Eden, though frustrated by the delay, waited with quiet loyalty. Churchill delayed his resignation several times. Each time, citing new reasons, unfinished speeches, global developments, health fluctuations. But finally, on April 5, 1955. He informed the Queen that he would resign. He did not announce it publicly at first. He simply walked away from the role. No grand farewell speech. No dramatic exit. Just a quiet, handwritten letter. And a slow walk from Downing Street to his waiting car. As the door closed behind him, reporters gathered across the street. Cameras clicked faintly. He raised his hand, offered a small, tired wave, and disappeared from view. It was the last time he would walk out of Number 10 as Prime Minister. Retirement did not come easily to Churchill. He still held a seat in Parliament, but rarely attended. He had lost not only power, but the rhythm of duty. His days became quieter. Chartwell, Hyde Park Gate. The occasional visit to the south of France. He once said, "The most melancholy thing in life is to remember the golden hour after it has passed." And yet, he bore no bitterness. He did not rant. He did not criticize his successors. He simply faded. There is something deeply human in that. A man, once at the center of the world, now sitting in his garden, watching sparrows collect twigs from the lawn. No regret spoken. Just silence. History rarely allows its great actors to exit quietly. But Churchill, in his way, insisted upon it. There was no final manifesto. No attempt to reclaim lost attention. He chose instead the path of dignity. He became a symbol, not of the future, but of memory. He allowed others to speak. He read. He painted. He watched. And the world, though still noisy, seemed to hold a collective breath in his presence. We leave him now, sitting in his chair, a shawl draped across his knees, his hand resting on a worn copy of Gibbon. Outside, the rain has begun to fall. Softly, steadily, on the stones of his garden path. The door remains ajar, but no one calls. The stage is dimmed. The audience has turned. And still, he remains, quiet and composed, in the hush after greatness. Imagine yourself in a quiet room. The air is still. The curtains are drawn against the soft afternoon light, and the only sound is the gentle turning of pages. You are inside Churchill's private study, a room lined from floor to ceiling with books, each one carefully chosen, many marked with penciled notes in the margins. The furniture is well worn. The smell is a mix of paper, leather, and the faint, earthy trace of pipe tobacco. In the corner, a globe rests on its stand, slightly faded, its edges thumbed by time. And at the desk sits the man himself. Older now. Quiet. Reading slowly, eyes half closed, lips moving just enough to shape each word. He is not preparing for a speech. Not drafting policy. Not recalling battles. He is simply exploring. Churchill was never far from the past. Even before he was a statesman, he was a writer. A lover of the ancients. A man whose library included volumes in Latin and Greek. And who once confessed that the writings of Edward Gibbon had influenced his whole view of history. In retirement, he read more than ever. But not just politics or military history. He returned to the classics. Tacitus, Herodotus, Livy. He pored over archaeological journals, reading about new digs in the Middle East, about Egyptian temples, Minoan palaces, and Viking burials. These were not idle curiosities. They were doors into other ages. He once remarked to a friend, "All civilization is a thin crust laid upon the volcano of the past." He saw in ancient ruins not only beauty, but warning and reassurance that what we build may not last forever, but that our efforts echo still. Churchill's passion for painting was not a hobby. It was a necessity. He began painting during a period of deep depression, what he called his black dog, in 1915. And it stayed with him for the rest of his life. In the decades that followed, particularly in retirement, he would retreat to his studio at Chartwell, a space filled with natural light and the quiet scent of linseed oil and canvas. There, he painted landscapes, seascapes, even still life. He painted Marrakesh, from memory, pale sun over dusky rooftops. He painted Chartwell's brick wall, dappled with moss and rain. He painted ponds, trees, churches, always with deliberate slowness. "When I paint," he once said, "I forget everything else. The world outside could roar or whisper, it made no difference." He was not a master by technique, but by sincerity. Each painting was an act of presence, of grounding, of peace. And in his final years, surrounded by his own works, he found company not in politics, but in color. Churchill was a collector, not of wealth or medals, but of moments, of stories, of civilizations long gone. His study was something between a library and a personal museum. There were ancient coins in small velvet trays, Roman denarii, Greek drachmae, worn smooth by the hands of history. On a side table, a framed drawing of a bust of Pericles, his favorite orator of classical Athens. A dusty photograph from his time in the Sudan, showing a much younger Churchill in uniform, squinting into the harsh desert light. A shard of blue pottery from Egypt, gifted by an archaeologist friend. He had a fascination with lost empires. Babylon, Rome, Byzantium. Not for their conquests, but for their fragility. He believed all nations, Britain included, were impermanent. "Time," he once wrote, "is the great dissolver of empires." This awareness didn't make him bitter. It made him thoughtful. It gave him humility. And it made the quiet of his final years all the more meaningful. In these quiet days, Churchill would sometimes speak of dreams. Not nightmares, not visions, but drifting, vivid sequences. "Last night," he told Clementine once, "I dreamed I was walking among the ruins of Carthage. It was very quiet and very familiar." There is no record of whether this was a recurring dream, but it speaks to something deep within him. He saw history not as dead stone, but as something living, a current running beneath the surface of our lives. He viewed his own legacy as one thread in a vast, ongoing weave, a temporary voice in a very long conversation. He did not need to be remembered as a monument, only as part of the record, as one who tried. Even in his last years, Churchill remained committed to writing. After stepping down from public life, he completed his multi-volume work, A History of the English-Speaking Peoples. 4 volumes. Over 1,000,000 words. A sweeping, yet deeply personal, chronicle of the Western tradition as he understood it. It was not a purely academic work. It was a reflection. An attempt to pass down a worldview. A map of values, mistakes, and hopes. He traced the line from Alfred the Great to the American Constitution. From Magna Carta to modern Parliament. It was not without flaws. It omitted much. But it was sincere. And in his study, when he read it over again, he did not do so with pride, but with calm. The world, he once said, is an old place. Older than we know. But the flame carries on. His words were meant to carry that flame forward. Quietly. Gently. Unfolding in the hands of future readers. Like you. Even as his health declined, Churchill's curiosity never fully dimmed. He asked visitors about new archaeological finds. He requested updates from museums. He continued to fund historical societies, and occasionally donated artifacts from his private collection. Once, near the end, he was shown photographs of a newly discovered Roman villa in the English countryside. He studied the mosaic patterns in the photos with quiet intensity. Then looked up and said, "They must have heard the birds. Just as we do. Isn't that something?" And it is. To imagine Churchill, in his final years, not as the lion of war, but as a man contemplating the same birdsong heard across centuries. It reminds us of the stillness beneath the storm, of the inner world that lives quietly inside each of us. We will end this segment here. In the hush of the study, among the dust of books and the faint scent of oil paint and old paper, you may picture him now, gently dozing in his chair. A book resting on his lap. A globe softly turning beside him. As shadows lengthen across the walls. There is no urgency. Only patience. There is no noise. Only the soft, steady rhythm of memory. Imagine yourself stepping outside, leaving the quiet study behind. The air is cool, but not cold. The sky is painted in soft pastels of dusk, and the distant hum of a city moving forward echoes faintly. You find yourself walking along the paths of a country that is changing. Slowly, surely, in ways both visible and subtle. Churchill's Britain is not the Britain you see now. It is a world caught between eras. A twilight merging the past with an uncertain dawn. Winston Churchill was, in many ways, the embodiment of the British establishment. He belonged to a class of gentlemen who believed in duty, honor, and the steady hand of tradition. His world was one of country houses, private clubs, and exclusive circles. At Chartwell, his beloved home, he would entertain guests beneath high ceilings, in rooms filled with heavy wooden furniture, deep rugs, and oil paintings of ancestors long past. Tea was served on fine china. The garden was meticulously tended. The routines were measured and deliberate. This was a world that prized continuity, where the past was not forgotten, but a guiding presence. Churchill, in his twilight years, remained a pillar of this world. His manner was old-fashioned. His speech tinged with Victorian cadences. His dress impeccable, even as fashions changed around him. Yet, even within this world, the tides were rising. The Britain Churchill left behind was a country emerging from war into something new. The welfare state was expanding. New industries were growing. Immigration was beginning to reshape the social fabric. The young no longer looked to inherited privilege as a given. They sought change. Opportunity. This new Britain was noisy and restless. In the cities, jazz and rock and roll began to fill the airwaves. New voices clamored for attention. Churchill himself was aware of these changes. He once remarked, "The old order passes, but the new is not yet born." He saw the tensions, the contradictions. The elite world of country estates and powdered wigs stood beside the rising hum of factories, buses, and bustling markets, while Churchill enjoyed the serene routine of Chartwell. Millions of Britons were navigating very different realities. In urban centers, families were still recovering from bomb damage. Rationing, though officially ended, lingered in habit and memory. The working class faced long hours in factories and offices. Housing shortages were common. These lives were filled with a different rhythm. Fast, practical, often noisy. In contrast, the elite maintained a world of measured leisure. Garden parties, horse riding, afternoon tea. Churchill's life, even in retirement, was cushioned by servants, gardeners, and close friends. He was aware of the gulf. Not with judgment, but with quiet acceptance. He understood that Britain was many Britons, each living its own rhythm. As the 1950s progressed, new technologies changed the way people lived. Television sets appeared in living rooms. Automobiles became more common. But Churchill was a reluctant participant in these changes. He preferred the company of books to screens, face-to-face conversations to telephone calls. His letters, often handwritten, reflected a world where communication was deliberate, considered. He missed none of the distractions. His retreat was partly by choice, partly by necessity. The physical demands of modern life were less suited to him now. And perhaps, too, there was a certain comfort in the familiar, in the patterns of a world he had helped build. In his last public speeches, Churchill spoke softly about change. He acknowledged the inevitability of new ideas, new generations. But he also warned of forgetting the lessons of history. "We stand upon the shoulders of those who came before us," he said. "And we must be careful not to stumble into darkness." This was not a call to resist change, but to temper it with wisdom. He saw himself as a bridge between eras. A man who had faced the horrors of war, who had seen empires fall and nations rise, and who hoped to pass on a measure of calm reflection. In the final months of his life, Churchill's world grew quieter still. Visitors came less often. His health declined. At Chartwell, he sat by the fire, sometimes staring into the flames. He listened to the ticking of clocks, felt the soft weight of a book in his hands. Occasionally, a servant would bring him a cup of tea, or open the window to let in the scent of rain on the garden. He was a man who had once commanded armies and nations, now reduced to moments of stillness and contemplation. His farewell was not public. It was personal. Churchill died in January 1965, aged 90. His passing was marked by a nation still divided in opinion, yet united in respect. The world he left was vastly different from the one he had known. Britain was no longer an empire, but a nation finding its place in a new order. And Churchill's legacy was a complex one. Part lion, part scholar, part man of contradictions. But through it all, one thing remained clear. He was a man who had lived fully, who had fought with both pen and sword, and who had, in the end, sought peace. As you gently close your eyes, imagine the soft footsteps fading down the corridors of history. The lamps dimming in the great houses. The quiet hum of change carrying on, as always. And somewhere, in a garden at twilight, a man sits peacefully, wrapped in the gentle rhythm of a life well lived. The past whispers softly, and the night embraces you. You are here now, back in the stillness of your room. The lights are low. The air is still. The rhythm of the past has softened into the hush of the present. We have wandered, calmly, through the twilight years of a man once forged in fire. Winston Churchill. A name often spoken with gravity, often conjured with certainty. But tonight, we have seen a different portrait. Not the myth. Not the wartime defiance. Not the echoing speeches over crackling radios. But the slow, retreating rhythm of a man. A man no longer called to action, but still deeply attuned to the weight of history. In these last decades, we saw not triumph or tragedy, but something gentler. We saw mornings spent in dressing gowns, with coffee, newspapers, and silence. Afternoons bent quietly over canvas, where colors held more urgency than crowds. We watched a statesman linger in the back benches of a changing parliament, still respected, but no longer required. And we glimpsed the private man, among his books, his brushes, and his memories. He did not rage against the coming night. He simply drifted into it, with measured breath and steady quiet. And isn't that a kind of grace? As you lie here, still and warm, you may find yourself thinking not of Churchill the leader, but Churchill the observer, the reader, the painter, the elder. His life, so long filled with urgency, ended not with thunder, but with slow, deliberate steps, and a return to the things that made him feel most human. We are all, in the end, shaped by time, by the world that calls us, and the silence that follows when it no longer does. Tonight, may you rest in that silence. May you feel the weight of soft blankets, the quiet thrum of your own breath, the stillness of the world beyond your window. And may the echoes of history settle into your dreams. Not as noise, but as comfort. Not as urgency, but as understanding. Winston Churchill lived through storms, but he ended in calm. And so may you. Good night. And thank you for spending this time with us, here, on Historical Nights.